All right, welcome everyone to the Guava and Osterman Research webinar today. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Product Marketing Manager here at Guava, and I'll be your host today. We do have a number of people here on this call today, and we're excited for you to be here. And we are always pleased to bring to you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Today, we will be discussing the growing need for mobile device archiving. Just a little background on Michael. He is an industry expert and the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in high-tech research in the high-tech research industry, and has spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging and collaboration industries. A couple of things to take note of. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So as we go through the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to put them through on the chat or on the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Michael. Let's get him on the line here. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I am, Q. Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. We've got a lot to cover today. Just a little bit about Osterman Research, just to expand beyond what Q mentioned, just so you know where we're coming from in all of this. We're really focused on, as Q mentioned, on the messaging industry. So we're focused, obviously, on messaging and collaboration and social media, email, basically any way that people communicate or collaborate in an electronic context and in the workplace. So our focus areas include, certainly archiving, security, encryption, content management, and so forth. And we have a very strong emphasis on primary research, and we'll be going through some of that here today. We talk usually to, sort of middle management in the IT space, really to understand the problems that they're experiencing, the kinds of things that they'd like to be able to do that they can't do today, and so forth. So let's get right into it in terms of the content. Certainly you don't need me to tell you that the use of mobile devices is increasing. We're seeing that anecdotally, we're seeing it in statistics of every type. The mobile device marketplace is just absolutely exploding. There are more and more devices in use in the workplace, more and different types of devices in use and so forth. What we found in some recent research, for example, is that the typical user employs about 2.5 mobile devices in the course of their work. A smartphone, maybe 2 smartphones, a tablet, a laptop computer, and so forth. So we're finding this explosion of mobile devices that are being used, with a lot of the work that people are doing, as we'll get into here in just a bit, a lot of the work that they're doing actually transferring to those mobile devices and away from the traditional desktop. Now, what we're talking about in terms of mobile devices is not only the devices themselves, but also the way that they're delivered into the organization. The bring your own device phenomenon, for example, is simply exploding. We're seeing lots of people that are using their own devices, sometimes being paid a stipend by their employer, but very often not. They want the latest and greatest, and they don't want to be constrained by maybe some sort of an ROI decision on this new device or any sort of financial constraint, and so they go out and buy their own device and start using it for work purposes. But what we're also talking about is BYOA and BYOC, bring your own applications, things like Dropbox, the hundreds or thousands of different mobile apps that are available that can be used in a workplace context for things like cloud-based storage and so forth. And we're also talking about BYOC, bring your own cloud. A lot of these applications have a cloud-based component that will actually store corporate information. Again, Dropbox, any of the number of cloud-based applications that are used to enhance the work experience and really to sort of plug the holes that IT can't necessarily afford to fill and that maybe the users want. Maybe they have special needs that IT can't really fulfill. And so they go out and they get a mobile application, they use a cloud-based service, they use their own device, and all of that is used to generate, process, and store corporate data. So the implications of the paradigm shift are actually quite significant. We're seeing lots and lots of corporate data that is moving out to the cloud, that is moving to independently managed applications, and over time, IT is getting less and less control of corporate data. In recent research that we've done, we've found that 5% of all of the data owned by the typical corporation is actually on a mobile device, and a lot of that is stored in the cloud. So we're seeing a lot of of change in the way that work is done. We're seeing a lot of change in the way that content is managed, and organizations absolutely need to respond to be able to meet these dynamics. So what you'll find here too in this chart, essentially this came from a very large BYOD study that we did, and we found, regardless of organization size, no surprise, everybody has email. There is some sort of a corporate email component that everybody interfaces with. But the smaller the organization, the more likely organizations are to employ smartphones and tablets. We see, for example, in enterprise level companies, 1,000 or more employees, that there are far fewer tablets than there would be, for example, in small organizations. But we're still finding significant and growing penetration for all of these mobile device types, regardless of organization size. So in terms of the data that we did for the mobile archiving survey, we found, no surprise here, lots of different mobile devices in use. About 2 out of 5 users reported that their primary mobile device was an iPhone. About 1 out of 5 indicated it was an Android smartphone. We found lots of iPads, BlackBerry smartphones, Windows phones, lots of different device types, and certainly lots of different versions of operating systems. Not so much on the iPhone side, but there are lots of flavors of Android operating system in use out there, which further complicates the issue for IT when they're trying to manage all of this content that users are storing on mobile devices, generating on mobile devices, and storing in the cloud. We also found in the most recent survey that about 30% of the mobile devices in use are owned by employees, 70% by their employers. We also found when we broke out the data by heavily regulated industries and those that were less heavily regulated, manufacturing, retail, and so forth, that there was, employees in the heavily regulated industries, were slightly more likely to use personally owned devices. A little bit counterintuitive because normally organizations want to control a bit more in heavily regulated industries than they do otherwise. But we found something that was not really surprising, but a little bit counterintuitive. And again, as I mentioned, the typical worker employs a mean of 2.5 mobile devices. So we're seeing lots of mobile devices in use and lots of venues in which this data is stored. More from the survey. One of the interesting things that we found, and we surveyed primarily people obviously that were information workers, people who are using some sort of a computing device, whether it's mobile or stationary, as part of their work. One of the things that was really interesting, though, is that we found that 1/3 of these employees' time is spent working on a mobile device. This is up dramatically over just the past few years. We found that about half of their time is spent working on a desktop computer or some sort of a stationary computing device, and only 15% of their time is not spent working on a computer. So, clearly people are generating data, they're accessing data, they're moving it around, largely from desktop computers, but increasingly for mobile devices. What we also found, too, is that 42% of the electronic content that employees use is actually used on a mobile device. Content that they're accessing over the web, reports that they're reading, other documents within the organization, emails, memos, et cetera, et cetera. But we found that about 1/3 of the electronic content that employees generate, that 1/3 that they create, is actually created on a mobile device. That was a little bit surprising, only in terms of the scope of how much content actually gets created on a mobile device. And we're seeing a lot of this, I think, because of the move toward tablets. Certainly a lot of people will continue to use traditional laptop computers and so forth, but we're finding more and more content that is being generated on iPads, Android tablets, and so forth. And in large part because there are some pretty good productivity applications, Office-like capabilities that are available on iPads and Surface devices, Android smartphones, and so forth, that actually allow you to create word processing documents, to manage spreadsheets, and so forth. So we're seeing a lot more of this content that is actually being generated on the mobile devices themselves before it ever reaches any sort of a corporate server. Then we also found that when we split out the data by heavily regulated and less heavily regulated organizations, that These figures were a little bit lower for heavily regulated firms, as we would have expected, simply because there needs to be more control in companies, that serve, for example, the financial services industry, healthcare, energy, and so forth. There needs to be tighter controls, simply because there are more statutes and more regulations focused on what you need to do with the data in terms of archiving and overall content management. One of the things we found as well in the research is that mobile archiving just is really not very adequate today. We found that only half of the work-related content that actually gets created on a mobile device ever is archived to a central corporate location so that the entire organization can access it. Now, this is perhaps the most critical thing that we found in our research, in that a lot of users are creating content on a mobile device, but they don't archive it to a central location. And so if it's needed for e-discovery, for a regulatory audit, if it's simply needed by other employees so that they have more business intelligence with which to do their work, it's simply not available because it just doesn't exist on a corporate server that is accessible to the entire organization. Now, we found that archiving of work-related content on a mobile device is a little bit higher in heavily regulated industries, but only slightly. So that's even more of a problem, because if you have an obligation, a statutory obligation, some sort of a regulatory requirement to archive all of the relevant business content that you generate, and a lot of it isn't generated, that can create some very serious problems for the organization. Certainly in less heavily regulated organizations as well, but particularly those that face very strict regulations like financial services or healthcare. Now, what we found in terms of what gets archived, not surprisingly, email is the primary thing that gets archived from a mobile device. Certainly a lot of people are accessing some sort of a corporate server for email, so it's sort of an automatic archiving. They generate an email on a mobile device, it automatically gets archived to a corporate server. So, again, not a real surprise there. We also found that about half of the content that gets archived is documents, or about half of the documents, I should say, that get created on a mobile device actually get archived. But then from there, when you get into things like phone call log data, text messages, social media posts, and other content, there's really very little of that gets generated on a mobile device, but that ever finds its way into some sort of a corporate archive. Now, this is a very serious problem. Today, most organizations don't archive text messages. They don't archive social media posts. They don't archive their phone call log data. They really do need to. We are finding more and more cases where things like SMS, social media content, and so forth is being required as part of e-discovery. There is important corporate content that is being generated in these venues, and very little of it actually is being archived to some sort of a central corporate location. If you go through FindLaw or any of the other law databases, you'll find that increasingly things like Facebook posts, tweets, text messages, and so forth are being called for in things like wrongful termination suits, just a wide variety of different types of legal actions. And if an organization is not archiving this content, they're potentially running the risk of not being able to produce it when called upon. That can create some enormous risk for the organization. We also found, finally here, that the figures for what actually gets archived from a mobile device to a central location is really not all that different for heavily regulated industries. Again, more of a problem for them simply because of the tighter regulations for archiving. Now, we found also some additional archiving problems as well. For example, we found that about 2 out of 5 respondents in the survey reported that their mobile device content is archived continuously via cellular or Wi-Fi networks. Obviously, that's a good thing. If you create content, it should be archived as soon as possible to some sort of a central corporate archive. Because a device can be lost, because content can be corrupted or changed, it's important to be able to archive as quickly after creation as possible. Excuse me. What we also found, though, is that about 29% of content from a mobile device is archived only when the device is actually physically connected to the corporate network. We get a lot of road warriors, we have a lot of travelers and so forth that will archive only occasionally, maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. We find that in a lot of organizations, people are working from home or they're working from a Starbucks much of the time. And so a lot of this content will get created on the mobile device, and it simply will sit there until somebody is physically connected to the corporate network and then able to synchronize all of their content with the corporate archive. We also found that for about 1 out of 9 organizations, content is archived over the air, but only when connected to the corporate Wi-Fi network, not when connected at home or in some other location. So we're finding that a lot of organizations simply aren't archiving all of the content from mobile devices as they need to, or at least are not archiving it as quickly as they need to. We found in terms of the frequency of archiving for mobile devices, for about half of users, archiving is immediate and continuous. But for 29%, they experience sometimes short delays in archiving, but about 1 out of 8 experience rather long delays in archiving. Again, that can create some real problems, and 1 out of 8 organizations simply isn't sure. And that's in large part due to the fact that there are so many personally owned devices and personally managed applications out there that IT simply isn't sure if all of this corporate content ever is making its way into the corporate archive. That creates a real problem for organizations that need to manage their content more effectively. So in terms of other problems with current mobile archiving practices, a lot of employees really don't have their mobile content archived to a central location where it's accessible at all. We find that in many cases, people will be able to create things on a laptop, on an iPad, on even a smartphone, and that content never makes its way into the corporate archive. That creates a serious problem for organizations that really should be archiving all of their relevant business records, but that simply aren't. And we found that among those that do have their mobile content archived, whether it's immediate or over a longer period, the process is really often delayed. Again, because they have to be connected to the corporate network, they can't do it over a Wi-Fi network. They don't have a system in place to adequately archive the content and so forth. And certainly, the bring your own applications and bring your own cloud phenomenon is making the problem worse because you have more and more content that is now under employee control and not under corporate control. That creates a number of problems, particularly when employees leave the company. For example, if they have a Dropbox account or Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive account and they have lots of corporate content stuffed away in it and they leave the company, how does IT get to it? How does the legal department get to it if you ever have to go through e-discovery, if you have to produce content for a regulatory audit and so forth? You simply can't. You don't have access to it anymore. Now, there may be occasions where you can go to the employee and they'll send you files or you can access an account online, but that's really the exception and not the rule. So fundamentally, mobile is inherently less archivable and less accessible for most organizations, largely because they don't have the systems in place that are able to deal with this content. And we're also finding, along with BYOA and BYOC, that the bring your own device phenomenon is making the problem worse. So, fundamental question, is that a problem? Well, in a word, yes. Content management for litigation becomes a lot more difficult because you can't place a legal hold on data, particularly if you don't even know it exists. If it's sitting on a mobile device somewhere and you as an IT decision maker or as a legal decision maker have no idea about this content, you can't place a legal hold on it. You can't do e-discovery on it. And so you run the risk of spoliation of evidence simply, going to court, for example, and saying, here's all of the evidence we have, not knowing about maybe a few thousand documents that might have been relevant that you really were supposed to produce. That can create very serious problems for an organization from a legal perspective, from a corporate reputation perspective, and so forth. And organizations that are in heavily regulated industries, again, financial services, healthcare, energy, life sciences, and so forth, really can't produce all of their relevant content either. And so they can suffer sanctions if they're not able to produce all of this content. Maybe they have fines levied against them. Perhaps content is lost if a mobile device is lost, or if somebody flushes the storage on a mobile device when they leave the company. You've got valuable corporate content that never makes its way into the archive, and so it's lost to the organization as a whole. Also, employee productivity can suffer. Just from a functional perspective, if stuff that employees are generating on a mobile device is not being transferred back to an archive, or at least to some sort of a file server where it's accessible to other employees, you can run into version control problems. Data mining becomes more difficult. And we're seeing the next phase of archiving really turning into sort of a business intelligence exercise, where people are going into the archive and extracting intelligence from their archived content. If you're not archiving all of the content that your employees are generating, that's going to become much more difficult, if not impossible, because you're not going to have all of the relevant data that you need. So what should you do? Now, any list of recommendations is obviously going to vary based on the organization, how heavily regulated you are, how many mobile device users you have, how geographically distributed your employees are, and so forth. But at least at a high level, you really need to understand where your data is. What we find in our research is that a lot of decision makers really don't know where all of their data is. Certainly it's in the research we've done, we find that data is scattered all over an organization. Lots of different venues, lots of different locations in the cloud, and much of it is under employee control. So IT really doesn't have a great idea in many cases where all of that data is. It can be on, certainly IT managed infrastructure, but a large proportion of it is also on infrastructure that's managed by employees in, various cloud-based accounts on their personal devices and so forth. The next thing you need to do is develop very thorough policies about how mobile is to be used in the organization. You certainly need to focus on the devices that can be used, the operating systems, the operating system versions. You need to focus on all of the various mobile apps, cloud-based applications, and so forth that employees might want to use. And we never recommend implementing any sort of draconian control that says thou shalt not use Dropbox or OneDrive or Google Drive, but instead either manage the applications that employees have access to, recommend certain ones, or better yet, implement a true enterprise-grade solution that's going to provide the same functionality as all of these tools that employees are using, but that will put IT in charge of managing that content, archiving it, having access to it, and so forth. And certainly you want to identify locations for content storage in your policies. Make sure that you know where your data can be stored and where you can find it if you're going to need it. And then implement the technologies that are really going to help you enforce these corporate policies. You absolutely need to have solutions that are going to archive content from mobile devices in real time, or at least near real time, to systems that are under IT control. That's really essential. You need to be able to access data from mobile devices, and as soon as it's created, or as close to soon as after it's created, be able to move it into some sort of a corporate archive so that now IT is in control of managing all of this content. And you need to deploy archiving tools that are going to enable archiving directly from the mobile devices themselves. Certainly most organizations today don't have that. They really do need to have it, simply because so much content today is created on mobile devices. Okay, and that concludes my part of the presentation. Here's our contact information if you do have any questions. Q, I'd like to hand it back to you now.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and thanks for the information. Great information. Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them through in the chat and the Q&A. We did have a few come through, so we will address those. But as we're going through, if you have any, feel free to put those through and we'll get to them. So the first one that came through is, what should we be archiving from mobile devices, like call logs, text? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, I'd say anything and everything should be archived. Certainly, the documents that created are critical. Email is obviously one of the critical issues, one of the critical content types, I should say, that needs to be archived. But we recommend actually archiving text messages, social media posts, and so forth, because anything that you generate that has business content in it is potentially relevant for e-discovery, for some sort of a regulatory audit you might have to go through. And so any business content, regardless of how it's generated or where it's generated, really should make its way into a corporate archive.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, the next one here is, do you think there's pushback from employees about archiving mobile data?
I think there is. Yeah, I think in a lot of organizations there certainly would be, because so many of these devices are personally owned. And anytime you're telling an employee, yeah, you own the device, but we own the data, there's going to be a tension. There are technologies out there that allow you to basically give a mobile device two personalities, a mobile one and an IT one or a corporate one, that allow IT to manage only the corporate information, archive it, wipe it if necessary, and so forth. But yeah, I think there's going to be pushback, and that's why I think the policies need to be established up front so that nobody's taken by surprise, and so that you're not having to sort of manage from the rear. If you have an entire population of unmanaged, personally owned mobile devices, and then you decide to implement policies, you're going to get a lot more pushback, I think, than if you are out front with it, saying, if you want to work here and you want to use a mobile device, that's fine, but here are the rules.
Great, thank you. Let's see. The next one here, should we be archiving data from what you were talking about, like the applications, BYOA, and bring your own cloud? Are those things that should be archived?
I think they should be, yeah, because I mean, if you're looking at how users employ Dropbox, for example, and not to single out Dropbox, but they're such a popular tool. You get lots of corporate content stored in Dropbox. People will store presentations and word processing documents and spreadsheets, all sorts of corporate content. And their intent in almost every case is to be more productive, to be able to have access to the most recent content when they're working at home, when they're traveling, when they're sitting on an airplane somewhere. That is really it's essential to be able to get to that data, simply because a lot of your corporate content, a lot of the discoverable content, for example, simply lives in the cloud in employee-managed applications. And that's not an ideal scenario. Certainly it would be better if it was under IT control with the same functionality as a Dropbox. But the reality is that you've got a lot of corporate content that's under the direct control of employees, and IT somehow needs to gain access to that.
Perfect. All right, that looks like all the questions for now. Thanks, Michael. That's great information, great answers there.
Great, thank you.
Just a couple of reminders here. Everyone who registered and attended this webinar will receive a copy of the Osterman Research White Paper, The Growing Need for Mobile Device Archiving. So you'll be getting an email with that, with a link to download this paper. And then also, just as a reminder, since Guava, we're hosting this, just wanted to let everyone know that we have a solution to manage and archive mobile communications. It's called Retain Mobile, and the solution archives mobile communications for Android and BlackBerry, in addition to doing email and social media in one central archive. If you want more information about that, feel free to visit us at guava.com or give us a call. Once again, Michael, thanks for your time and for your information, great information, and thanks everyone for being in attendance.